The scream shattered the silence of the old house, tearing through the night, as if the walls themselves cried out. Hannah clutched her chest, her breath ragged, her heart pounding against ribs that felt too fragile to contain it. The darkness seemed to tighten around her, pressing like unseen hands upon her shoulders. She whispered, "Who's there?" but her voice trembled, swallowed by the suffocating air. The scratching began again, faint at first, then sharp, like fingernails dragging across brittle wood. Hannah staggered toward the hallway, each step creaking beneath her weight. The shadows stretched unnaturally along the peeling wallpaper, growing longer than the lamp's dim light should allow. She called out, "Stop it!" But the sound of her words only deepened the silence that followed. A sudden gust rattled the windows, though the night outside was still. Her reflection in the cracked mirror appeared slower to move, lingering half a second too long, her eyes wide and glistening with fear. She pressed her palm against the wall, the cold surface vibrating as though something pulsed beneath it. Hannah whispered, "This house is alive," her voice cracking into a sob. The air turned icy, and from deep within the wall, a hollow whisper curled around her ears, mocking her sanity with words she could not understand. She staggered back, the realization burning inside her chest. Something was in the walls, watching, waiting, breathing alongside her every move. The silence pressed heavy after the scream, filling every corner with suffocating weight. Hannah leaned against the wall, trembling as though her bones carried the chill of the house itself. She muttered, "It can't be real," yet her words cracked with disbelief. The old staircase groaned, echoing like footsteps climbing, though no one moved. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening, her breath catching when the scratching returned, this time louder, hungrier. Shadows swayed across the ceiling, though the lamp was still, shifting like figures restless in the dark. Her heart hammered faster, her voice low. "Someone is in here with me." The thought seeped into her mind like poison, each repetition more convincing. She darted toward the kitchen, but every corridor seemed to bend, stretching longer, guiding her deeper into the labyrinth of the house. Her throat tightened, and she whispered, "I am not alone." The words sank like stones into the silence, swallowed by something unseen. The kitchen reeked of damp wood and rust, the faucet dripping into a stained sink. Hannah gripped the counter, her nails digging into the worn surface. She whispered, "Please stop," as if begging the house itself. A loud thud shook the wall behind her, sending dust raining down like ash. She spun, eyes wide, searching for the source, but only silence followed. The clock on the wall ticked erratically, skipping seconds, jerking forward like a broken heartbeat. Her reflection in the darkened window revealed a pale face that did not move in time with her own. She gasped and staggered back, whispering, "You're not me." The room grew colder, her breath forming clouds in the stagnant air, the faint scratching now echoing beneath the floorboards, as though the house itself was hollow and alive. The floor groaned beneath Hannah's feet, trembling with each hesitant step. She whispered, "I need to get out," but the hallway stretched endlessly, longer than before, bending into shadow. Her chest heaved, her pulse echoing louder than the silence. Doors lined the corridor, each closed, yet each seemed to breathe, wood expanding and contracting with slow rhythm. She reached for a handle, her hand shaking violently, but as her fingers brushed it, the handle turned on its own. She stumbled back, gasping, and the door creaked open into a yawning darkness that felt alive. She choked. No, but the shadows spilling out slithered across the floor, curling toward her feet like smoke. Hannah stumbled backward, her hand slamming against the wall, the vibration trembling like a living pulse. She cried, "Leave me alone!" But her voice cracked, fragile against the oppressive silence. The door yawned wider, the darkness within stretching like an endless throat. Whispers poured out, dozens of voices overlapping, words indistinguishable yet suffocating. Her knees buckled, tears streaking her pale cheeks as she collapsed to the floor. Shadows surged across the walls, shapes clawing from inside, straining to break free. She whispered, "This house is not empty," and her words hung like a curse, sealing her fate as the unseen presence pressed closer. Unseen, but undeniable. The dawn light crept through the fractured curtains, but the house still felt cloaked in night. Hannah sat on the floor with her back against the wall, her eyes bloodshot, her lips trembling. She whispered, "Why does it want me?" The question echoed within her head, unanswered and cruel. A memory surged forward unbidden. Of the night years ago, when she had been trapped in another room, alone and helpless. Her chest tightened as she remembered the locked door and the distant sound of fists pounding. She whispered, "I never escaped, did I?" as tears blurred her vision. The scratching in the walls came again, and it reminded her of that same sound from her childhood, the memory she had buried so deeply. The house seemed to know her secret, gnawing at her sanity with its familiarity. She clutched her knees tighter, rocking slightly, whispering, "You can't take me again." But the silence that followed was heavy, as if the unseen presence laughed at her desperation. The phone rang suddenly, startling Hannah into a gasp, its shrill tone jarring against the stillness. She snatched the receiver, her hands shaking. On the other end, Laura's voice came calm and steady. "Hannah, you sound terrible." Hannah swallowed hard and whispered, "There's something in the walls." Laura sighed audibly, dismissing her fear with the coolness of reason. Laura said, "Old houses creak, that's all." Hannah's voice broke as she pleaded, "You don't hear what I hear." But Laura, practical as always, replied, "You're tired, you're letting your past get to you again." The words struck Hannah like a blow, reopening scars she never healed. She whispered, "You never believed me, not then, not now." Silence hung thickly before Laura exhaled, "Hannah, get some rest." The line went dead, leaving Hannah clutching the receiver as if it might anchor her sanity. Hannah sat at the kitchen table, staring at the wood grain as if it might reveal an answer. Her chest rose in uneven breaths, her hands trembling. She whispered, "It knows me, Laura doesn't." The scratching returned, slow and deliberate, moving along the walls in steady rhythm. Hannah pressed her palms flat against the table, forcing herself not to run. She remembered nights locked in her childhood bedroom, the same scratching taunting her when no one believed her cries. She shook her head and whispered, "It followed me." The light bulb above flickered, dimming until the room seemed to hold its breath. The chair beside her scraped softly against the floor, though she had not touched it. Hannah gasped, whispering, "It's sitting with me." The empty air felt crowded, pressing down on her lungs, filling the room with suffocating presence. Later that evening, Hannah's cousin Emma arrived, her footsteps sharp against the porch. She stepped inside, her coat pulled tight. Emma said, "You look like you haven't slept in days." Hannah's eyes darted nervously to the walls as she whispered, "It doesn't let me." Emma glanced around, unimpressed, and said, "You're letting your imagination win again." Hannah shook her head violently. "No, Emma, it's real." Emma's skeptical tone cut sharper. "You've always been drawn to ghosts in your mind." The words stung, leaving Hannah's chest hollow. The scratching rose suddenly, loud and jagged, vibrating through the floor beneath them. Hannah screamed, "Hear it now." Emma froze, her eyes widening just slightly, but she steadied herself and muttered, "Houses make noise, Hannah." Yet the fear in Emma's voice betrayed the cracks in her certainty. When Emma left, Hannah stood alone by the window, the street lamps outside glowing dim against the fog. She whispered, "No one believes me," her voice hollow. The house seemed to breathe heavier in her solitude. The reflection in the window showed her face pale and gaunt, her lips quivering, but behind her the faint outline of a man seemed pressed into the wall. She spun, but the hallway was empty, shadows clinging to the wallpaper. She clutched the curtains and whispered, "You've been here all along." A gust rattled the glass, though the fog outside remained motionless. The scratching grew frantic, circling her, enclosing her within the very bones of the house. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "I cannot escape you." The silence afterward was worse than the sound, crushing her beneath its weight. The night pressed down like a suffocating blanket, every creak magnified until it felt like whispers crawling through the house. Hannah sat upright in her bed, her chest rising in shallow bursts. A faint shuffle echoed inside the walls, slow and deliberate, like footsteps pacing in hidden corridors. She whispered, "You're not gone, are you?" Her voice fractured, trembling in the air. The sound drew closer, then halted just beside her headboard. Hannah pressed her hand to the plaster, the vibrations rattling her palm like a heartbeat not her own. A coldness seeped through her skin, crawling up her arm until her teeth chattered. The silence stretched before a heavy knock struck from inside the wall, making her flinch violently. She cried softly, "Please stop," as tears streaked down her cheeks. But the knock came again, steady, mocking her pleas, as if the unseen thing was learning her rhythm and echoing her fear. Hannah stumbled into the hallway, her footsteps uneven as she clung to the wall for support. The floor groaned beneath her weight, echoing like distant sighs. She whispered, "Show yourself," though dread carved through every syllable. The air grew heavier, the temperature dropping until her breath became visible, clouds drifting before her. The shadows bent oddly at the far end of the corridor, forming a figure taller than the frame of the door. Hannah froze, her body rigid, her hands trembling violently. She whispered, "Who are you?" But the figure melted back into the darkness, leaving only the echo of the question bouncing against the walls. She collapsed against the railing, clutching it with white knuckles, her pulse crashing like thunder in her ears. The silence that followed seemed louder than any scream. The next morning, Hannah sat across the table from Emma, her eyes hollow, her body slumped. Emma stirred her tea calmly, her tone dismissive. "You're exhausted, Hannah. Nothing more." Hannah shook her head violently, whispering, "It's real, Emma. It touched me." Emma rolled her eyes and muttered, "Old houses creak. You always overthink." Hannah's trembling hand slammed against the table, rattling the cup. "Stop saying that," she cried, her voice breaking. Emma leaned back, frowning, and said, "You need help, not ghosts." Hannah's chest heaved, her gaze fixed on the walls, where faint scratches crept upward like words being written by unseen claws. She whispered, "It's happening right now." Emma turned sharply, her breath catching at the sight, but she quickly shook her head, refusing to admit what she saw. That evening, Hannah wandered into the parlor, the dust-laden curtains swaying, though no windows were open. She whispered, "I can feel you here." A voice rose suddenly, low and calm, startling her. A man in the shadows stepped forward, his presence unsettling yet strangely composed. His name was Richard, his eyes unreadable, his tone cryptic. Richard said, "The walls are not hollow. They remember." Hannah's lips parted, fear mixing with confusion. She asked, "What are you talking about?" Richard smiled faintly, never answering directly. "What you hear is not madness. It is memory clawing to be known." Hannah's knees weakened, her breath shallow as she whispered, "How do you know this?" Richard's gaze lingered on the trembling wallpaper as he murmured, "Because I've heard them too." Later, Hannah sat by the window, her face pale, her hands trembling as she pressed her forehead to the glass. Outside, the sky was bruised with storm clouds, lightning flashing faintly in the distance. She whispered, "I can't escape it." The reflection in the window rippled unnaturally, showing not only her face, but another staring back, gaunt and hollow-eyed. Hannah gasped, recoiling, but when she turned, the room was empty. The scratching rose again, frantic, crawling across every wall, circling her like a predator. She cried out, "Stop!" as her tears fell fast, streaking her face. The house groaned deeply, as though it laughed with wooden lungs. Hannah collapsed against the glass, whispering, "It's everywhere," her voice fading into a sob. The storm raged outside, lightning flashing through cracked windows, illuminating the parlor in fractured bursts. Hannah stood trembling, clutching a candle as shadows writhed on the walls. She whispered, "Show me what you are." The scratching rose again, louder, and the wallpaper peeled back slightly, as if something clawed from within. Hannah gasped, dropping the candle, its flames sputtering across the wooden floor. Behind her, Richard stepped closer from the shadows, his voice calm but grave. Richard said, "This house carries the bones of memory. Look closely," and you'll see him." Hannah turned, her face pale, her eyes wide, and whispered, "Who?" Richard's expression hardened, his eyes fixed on the wall. Richard said, "The man who never left." At that moment, the wall shuddered violently, a faint outline of a man pressing forward like a grotesque shadow trying to break free. Hannah screamed, "No," but the figure only grew clearer in the lightning's harsh flash. The next morning, Hannah searched the cellar, her lantern casting trembling circles of light on damp stone walls. Dust swirled as she uncovered a rotted wooden chair, chains dangling rusted and broken. She whispered, "He lived here." Her voice quivered with the weight of realization. Richard's voice echoed faintly from above, "Not lived, trapped." Hannah's hands shook as she touched the rusted links, her skin recoiling from their icy surface. The air thickened, her chest tightening, as faint whispers rose from the floorboards above, seeping down like dripping water. She whispered, "He's still here," her words breaking. The lantern flickered as the cellar groaned, wood creaking as if straining under a terrible secret. Hannah fell to her knees, clutching her lantern desperately, as shadows seemed to gather in a circle around her trembling form. That night, Hannah dreamed of a figure crawling through narrow passages, his gaunt body pressed against the beams. In her dream, she followed the sound of his breathing, shallow and ragged, echoing endlessly. She whispered, "Why are you here?" But the figure did not answer, only dragged his fingers along the wood, leaving deep scratches. When she reached for him, his head twisted unnaturally, his hollow eyes locking onto hers with unbearable emptiness. Hannah cried, "What do you want from me?" But the only reply was a rasping whisper that chilled her blood. "To be remembered." She woke, gasping, her throat raw, as though she had screamed in her sleep. The walls around her trembled faintly, carrying the echoes of the dream into waking life. Later, Hannah confronted Richard in the parlor, her eyes blazing with desperation. She demanded, "You knew this all along." Richard's expression was unreadable, his voice calm as he replied, "Knowledge does not always save, sometimes it binds." Hannah shook violently, crying, "He lived inside these walls, watching me." Richard lowered his gaze, whispering, "He was never just watching, he was waiting." Hannah's voice broke. "Waiting for what?" Richard stepped closer, his tone heavy. "For you." The silence shattered as the walls groaned loudly, plaster cracking as shadows surged outward. Hannah screamed, "Why me?" But Richard's eyes avoided hers, his silence more terrifying than words. Hannah wandered into the upstairs hallway, her steps hesitant, the candlelight flickering weakly against peeling wallpaper. She whispered, "What do you want from me?" The air grew heavy, each breath sharp and painful. The walls shuddered, and suddenly the voice rose from within, layered and hollow, whispering her name over and over. "Hannah." Her knees buckled as she clutched the banister, tears spilling down her cheeks. She screamed, "Stop!" But the voices only grew louder, crashing together like a chorus of broken souls. The outline of the gaunt man pressed fully against the wallpaper, his face stretching forward, his mouth opening in a silent scream. Hannah collapsed, whispering, "You are not gone." The candle blew out, plunging her into smothering darkness as the house seemed to exhale around her. The house stood silent, yet Hannah sensed betrayal lurking in the air heavier than the storm. She confronted Richard in the parlor, her hands trembling. Hannah said, "You knew all along, didn't you?" Richard's eyes avoided hers, his silence sharpening her fear. Hannah's voice cracked, "You brought me here knowing the truth." Richard finally spoke, "Knowledge doesn't set you free, Hannah. It binds you." The words echoed like a curse. Hannah screamed, "You lied to me!" The walls groaned in response, plaster splintering as if the house itself agreed. Richard stepped back, his face grim. Richard said, "I told you enough to survive. You didn't want the whole truth." Hannah felt her chest burn with fury and betrayal, her world crumbling as shadows flickered across her skin. Later, Hannah ran to the front door, her fingers clawing desperately at the lock. The handle twisted, but the door would not open. She whispered, "Let me out." A deep scratching echoed from the walls, circling like laughter. She turned, only to see Emma standing in the hallway, her expression cold. Emma said, "You always thought you could leave, Hannah. But you never could." Hannah's breath caught as she whispered, "You knew?" Emma smirked faintly. Some secrets stay buried because no one dares to speak them. Hannah collapsed against the door, her body trembling. Hannah cried, "You betrayed me too." Emma's eyes flickered with unease, but her voice stayed sharp. "I told you not to come here." The shadows on the wall rose higher, mocking Hannah's despair. In the kitchen, Hannah sat shaking, her hands pressed to her ears as the scratching grew louder. She whispered, "Stop it, please stop." The sound rose to a frenzy, like hundreds of nails tearing the wood. Suddenly, Laura's voice came through the telephone on the counter, calm yet sharp. Laura said, "You hear him now, don't you?" Hannah staggered to the receiver, crying, "You knew, Laura, you always knew." Laura's sigh was heavy. Laura said, "You were never supposed to remember." Hannah screamed, "Remember what?" But Laura's silence was the answer. The line went dead. The house groaned deeply, a sound so human it made Hannah's blood freeze. She dropped the receiver, the cord swinging like a noose, her tears falling fast. That night, Richard returned, his expression heavy with sorrow. Richard said, "You want answers, Hannah, but answers are chains." Hannah stepped forward, her voice fierce, "Tell me why he's here." Richard's voice lowered, "Because he chose to stay, and because you were chosen too." Hannah's stomach twisted, her legs weakening. Hannah whispered, "Chosen?" Richard nodded slowly. "Blood remembers. You can't hide from it." Hannah's eyes widened, rage colliding with fear. Hannah cried, "You knew I was tied to him all along." Richard's silence was sharper than any blade, his eyes shifting away as the shadows gathered closer. The wallpaper pulsed like a heartbeat, echoing Hannah's horror. Alone in the upstairs hall, Hannah's knees buckled as the voices in the walls rose in unison. They whispered her name, layered and endless. "Hannah, Hannah." She pressed her hands to the plaster, her voice breaking. Hannah cried, "Stop calling me." But the walls pulsed violently, and the gaunt figure pressed through, his hollow eyes meeting hers. Hannah gasped, whispering, "You're part of me." The figure's mouth opened in silent scream, shadows pouring into the hallway. Hannah collapsed to her knees, sobbing, "I can't escape you." The candle extinguished, plunging her into oppressive blackness. The whispers ceased, leaving only silence, and in that silence Hannah felt utterly betrayed by the house, by her family, and by her own blood. The night pulsed with unnatural silence, broken only by Hannah's sobs as she staggered into the cellar. Her lantern shook in her trembling hands, light spilling across chains that clinked faintly though untouched. She whispered, "Show yourself." The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest until she gasped for breath. Suddenly, the gaunt man's figure emerged from the wall itself, his hollow eyes glowing faintly. Hannah screamed, "Why me?" But the figure only stretched his arms toward her, his body grotesquely contorted. The shadows bent around him, swirling like black smoke. Hannah collapsed backward, clutching her lantern as Richard appeared behind her, his tone grim. Richard said, "This is your blood's curse." Hannah turned, her voice sharp with terror. "No, it's your secret." The cellar groaned, stones cracking as if the house itself listened. Hannah screamed as the walls around her shifted, beams snapping like brittle bones. She shouted, "You can't have me!" The gaunt man pressed closer, his mouth opening in a silent roar. Richard grabbed Hannah's arm, pulling her back. Richard said, "You must face him, Hannah." Hannah tore free, her eyes blazing with fury. Hannah cried, "You used me." Richard's voice broke. "I tried to protect you, but you were always part of this." The cellar shook violently, chains clattering, dust raining from the ceiling. Hannah raised her lantern, light spilling across the figure's hollow face. She whispered, "You've waited for me." The figure's breath rattled like wind through broken wood, his form pulsing closer. Hannah's knees shook, but she did not run. The house roared as if alive, wind rushing through cracks with deafening force. Hannah stood firm, though her body trembled violently. She shouted, "Tell me what you want." The gaunt man's head jerked unnaturally, his whisper slicing through the chaos. "To be remembered." Hannah's chest heaved, her tears spilling as she cried, "You're the man in the walls." Richard stepped forward, his voice sharp. Richard said, "He died here, rotting where no one could see, forgotten until now." Hannah staggered, her voice breaking. "He lived inside these walls, watching me." The figure reached for her, his skeletal hand brushing against her arm with icy touch. Hannah screamed, "No!" as sparks burst from her lantern, throwing wild shadows across the cellar walls. Hannah dropped the lantern, its flame bursting across the floor, firelight throwing grotesque shapes along the walls. She screamed, "You don't own me!" The gaunt man lunged forward, his body twisting through shadows. Richard shouted, "Fight him, Hannah!" Her body shook as she pressed her palms against the trembling wall, her tears falling. Hannah cried, "You're not my blood!" But the whispers rose, overlapping voices chanting her name. Richard shouted again, "Deny him, or he takes you!" Hannah screamed, her voice echoing through the collapsing cellar, "You're nothing but the dead!" The gaunt man recoiled violently, his form flickering like smoke caught in firelight, but his hollow eyes stayed locked on hers, burning with hunger. The fire spread quickly, heat licking at the walls as the shadows writhed like living creatures. Hannah staggered, her chest heaving, her voice breaking. Hannah cried, "You will not take me!" The gaunt man screamed silently, his form tearing apart in the fire's glow. Richard shouted, "It's working!" Hannah pressed forward, forcing her voice stronger, "You are nothing but memory." The figure thrashed, clawing at the walls as cracks split through plaster and stone. The voices that had haunted her wailed in unison, fading into shrieks. Hannah collapsed to her knees, sobbing, as the figure dissolved into ash-like smoke. Richard stepped forward, his voice low and heavy. Richard said, "But he is not gone, Hannah. He never leaves." Hannah raised her tear-streaked face, her silence heavier than words. The fire died down, leaving only ash and smoke clinging to the cellar walls. Hannah crawled upward through the cracked stairwell, her body shaking, her breath ragged. She whispered, "It's over," but the silence mocked her. The house groaned above as though disagreeing. Richard followed behind, his face pale, his voice low. Richard said, "He's gone, but not destroyed." Hannah turned, her eyes filled with exhausted rage. Hannah said, "You told me he would fade." Richard shook his head slowly. Richard said, "He never fades, Hannah. He waits." The words pressed into her chest, heavier than the smoke-filled air. She staggered to her feet, gripping the wall for balance, her tears burning her face as the house shivered around her. By morning, Hannah stood in the parlor, staring at the broken walls. Her hands trembled as she touched the cracked plaster, now cold and still. She whispered, "This house took everything." Richard stood near the fireplace, his eyes heavy with guilt. Richard said, "The house remembers because you remember." Hannah's throat tightened, her voice breaking. Hannah said, "He was trapped here, and now I am too." Richard shook his head, his voice almost pleading. Richard said, "You are stronger than him." Hannah's lips quivered, her eyes closing as tears slipped down. Hannah whispered, "No, I am already his." The words echoed through the silent parlor as if the house breathed them in. Hannah walked outside into the fog-drenched garden, her body weak, her clothes torn. The fresh air struck her like knives, too sharp, too clean. She whispered, "I should feel free," but her chest only tightened. Behind her, Richard stepped onto the porch, his tone stern. Richard said, "Leaving changes nothing. He follows." Hannah turned, her eyes wide with despair. Hannah said, "He will never let me go." Richard looked down, his silence confirmation. Hannah's breath came fast, her arms wrapping around herself as the fog swirled. The faint whisper of her name, Hannah, rose from the house itself, curling through the mist. Her face twisted in terror as she realized the wall's voice had followed her into the open air. That night, Hannah sat alone in her bedroom, the candle flickering low. She stared into the cracked mirror, her reflection hollow-eyed and pale. She whispered, "It will never end." From the corner of the mirror, another face appeared, the gaunt man's hollow eyes staring back at her. Hannah gasped, clutching the table, whispering, "You're still here." The whisper answered, layered and cruel, always. Hannah's tears fell fast, her voice breaking. Hannah said, "You'll never leave me." The reflection shifted, her own face melting briefly into his before returning. Hannah cried, "I'm already broken." The candles sputtered, shadows swallowing the room, the mirror still glimmering faintly with his shape. Near midnight, Hannah lay in bed, her body still, her eyes staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, suffocatingly so. Suddenly the scratching began again, soft at first, then louder, circling her room. Hannah whispered, "Please," her voice nearly gone. The shadows gathered along the walls, the gaunt man's outline pressing once more, closer than ever. His whisper filled the air, "We are one now." Hannah's body shook violently as tears streamed down her face. Hannah cried, "No," but the voice only laughed, hollow and endless. The final candle extinguished, plunging the room into complete darkness. The sound of scratching claws continued, endless, sealing her fate in silence that stretched beyond the night.